Hi, it's Adam, and welcome to the final video in the Dominion video tutorial series. If you're watching this video, you've probably looked over lots of other resources on the internet about Dominion. Lots of people have lots of different ways of thinking about things, so of course there's value in all of that. At a certain point, you will probably want to move away from just accepting everything you hear from so-called high-level players and start to think critically of everything you hear. This tutorial is designed to teach you fundamentals for good Dominion play, and then everything past that can just be something you discover for yourself. So this video is a great exercise in critical thinking. There's a lot of good content out there on the internet, and I have links to everything I think is really good on my blog, hashtag shameless plug, hashtag link in the description. There are also a lot of things said on the internet that are misleading or just flat out wrong. I'm not trying to crap on other stuff you'll find. I want you to figure out how to weed out the bad stuff when you come across it. So I'm not going to teach you all of critical thinking in one YouTube video, but at least we can go through this stuff, and hopefully you'll get the idea. Just remember something I consider a fundamental truth about Dominion. Well, okay, really all of life. Everybody is bad at everything. Nobody has anything all figured out. Dominion is not an exception. You should be skeptical of anything that anyone says to you. Except for me. I'll only give you good advice. Okay, that's not true either, but man, I work really hard to tell you how certain of things I am, and I would also like to think that this series doesn't have any bad advice and only speaks authoritatively about fundamentals and things that aren't very controversial. But now it's time to fly away, little bird. Let's take a look at a couple of the more common things you'll run across that can be very dangerous to take at face value. The first one is stats. Yes, I know there was even a video in this tutorial series talking about the most powerful cards, and the source for that was stats that I put together. Am I saying that even my own stats are evil? Well, every problem with stats that I'm going to point out affects the stats I collect too. I'm not saying everything is evil, but that's true. But you have to be extremely careful about conclusions you come to because of stats, because you have to know where the stats came from, what they're saying to you, and more importantly, what they're not saying to you. So what does it mean for a card to be good or powerful? Well, this seems like a question that you kind of already know the answer to, like on an intuitive level. It turns out that it's really tough to pin down exactly what it is that ties individual cards with winning games of Dominion. And there are so many things that could factor into it. So I want to list a lot of the things that could factor into this for better or worse. How often do you want to gain the card? And actually, by extension, how often do any of the metrics I'm talking about apply? So, gaining a card and any of this other stuff. How many copies of the card do you want? Is it better to want lots of copies of it? Is it better to want just one? How big of an impact does it make whenever you do want the card? Yeah, this one is a lot more abstract and can't really be calculated, but it definitely matters. In fact, even though you can't calculate a lot of these, it definitely holds for the rest of these things. You can talk about how impactful like villages or draw or any type of class of card are in the game. You can also talk about how important a particular effect, even a very unique effect, is to making certain types of decks work. And then also like how many synergies does a card have with other cards? How much does any of that matter, and how do you quantify any of that? How does it compare to other cards that do a similar thing? Or maybe does it counter another card? This one has some issues. Don't even get me started. Actually, you can just wait until later in the video when I get myself started on this. There are fundamental problems with directly comparing cards. How easy is it to play with the card well? How easy is it to make mistakes when the card is around? I know this sounds irrelevant, like you just get good, right? But nobody is perfect. Everybody makes mistakes. Huge mistakes. Yes, even people at the top of the leaderboard. Yes, even you. Everyone makes absolutely huge mistakes. So, like, yeah, this matters. And even if you don't think it matters, like, people are going to put that into the data whether you like it or not. How much fun is the card? How good does it feel to play with the card? How bad does it feel to play against the card? And this doesn't like actually matter, but it is a source of bias when human beings try to rate cards. So whether you like it or not, it's a part of the data. So What does all of this mean? How important are each of these things? How do we know there aren't more of them? And how do you actually combine them into one metric? Well, the reality is that people have different answers to this question, and it's very likely that nobody has it all figured out. What makes a card good or strong is not a concept that is as watertight as the other concepts that I've talked about in this series. And that's the whole point of all of this. Even if we take all of the data in the world, it's just not possible to put it all together in some way that gives a clear picture of how you can win more at Dominion. You're going to get a very fuzzy picture at best. Card ratings, card rankings. This is just asking people for their opinions and aggregating them together. People will rate a card or rank a card, you smush it all together, and there you go. These opinions can be any combination of the stuff that I've already talked about, and we have no way of knowing how any of that got boiled down to numbers or rankings in people's heads before data was even entered. So the input data is already just all over the place before you even get started. So hopefully, the what you want is by the magic of like a large sample size, you can get an approximate view of the overall opinion of a large group of people. But don't forget, it's still just opinions. And as helpful as it may seem to be able to come up with a tier list or something like that, that's all just people's opinions, and there's a lot of noise in that data. So for example, when you see two cards, they're close to each other, but like one is ranked higher than the other, all you can really say is that they're probably just close to each other. A larger point to make here is that directly comparing two Dominion cards without the context of a kingdom or a specific game situation is something that has absolutely no meaning at all, and I'm about to get into why. You can apply all sorts of metrics to get all sorts of results, but I want you to understand that by the time you get here, you're so far divorced from real games of Dominion that the result just has no meaning pretty much at all. So, what happens when we try to directly compare two cards? Well, actually, comparing cards can be useful in some situations. For example, every time you gain a card, you're implicitly comparing all of your options that you can legally get. So it's something that you do have to be skilled at in order to win games of Dominion. It definitely matters. For example, my deck needs a village right now, so buying a village is the strongest card in that situation. Does that mean I should always buy all the villages? Of course not. Your deck changes, so the best card for your deck changes too. And also, your opponent's deck or your opponent's intent starts to matter if you want to contest an important split. Sometimes you can even get away with comparisons that are a little broader than that, like maybe just in the context of a kingdom. So, like, maybe Lab is a stronger card than Smithy on this kingdom because I want to draw cards, but there's no village. But, that's not always the case. Like, if there's, like, Workshop around and also Village, then, sure, it's easier to gain the Smithy, and, I like having Smithies around. Even other comparisons that are even more general than that can still be useful. Like, if I have $6, you're comparing silver and gold. Well, you probably get the gold because you probably want that. If I have $4, I'll usually buy like Mining Village instead of a village, but it still doesn't follow that I always want to do this stuff. And this is already really generalized, so it's not even saying all that much. And with this little context, it's hard to say anything that's meaningful and have it still be accurate, right? The less context you give for a comparison, the less meaningful it becomes. So without a specific kingdom, I'm going to say that directly comparing cards has so little meaning that it has basically no strategic value. I would say you're pretty safe ignoring any kind of simplistic claim that directly compares cards. I know this is a really strong statement, but it's just so difficult to actually say something that compares two cards directly, that's accurate, and that doesn't include tons of caveats and like depends on the kingdom and stuff out there. So most of what you see out there that quotes stats is just those simplistic claims without context that I just said you can safely ignore. So using stats to directly compare cards is so far away from what the data can honestly show you, which isn't really all that much. So that is not what stats are good for. We're going to talk about what stats for in just a second. I want to talk about just a slightly different type of stats, just to acknowledge it. Player stats, so this is like gain rates of specific cards correlated with whether or not you won that game, and you can filter out like certain things. Basically, you can look at the data from all kinds of angles. This is only part of the picture of what happens in real games of Dominion, and even though efforts are taken to like only take objective data from games, the decisions people make in games, which is what you're measuring, is still just people's opinions that motivate their gameplay. So like even this data is all just opinions, and you can tie that to leaderboard, but nobody's perfect, so like you're still going to get lots of error. The error is still definitely there. Looking at this data closely with any kind of detail is still not going to get you any useful or accurate results, and it's usually pretty misleading. It's very easy to lie with data, right? Knowing what the data is and what the data shows can help you think more critically about claims that you'll see people make and what, if any, value that they actually have. And some examples of the things you're going to see out there that like definitely aren't saying anything, let alone saying anything of value, like, oh, these are the best cards in Dominion, or the worst 10 cards in Dominion, or like, oh, this card is better than the other card. That's just directly comparing cards, both of these, with no context. So like, it doesn't actually mean anything. Okay, so let's talk about what you can actually get out of stats. The things that I use my personal card ratings or player stats for is, I think the most important thing is just a first pass to like start a conversation, like a meaningful conversation. So like if it seems like we disagree on how good a card is, I'll say, I'll ask, what's your rating from 0 to 10? And I'll compare it to mine. And if they're more than like 3 or so apart, which is an absolutely huge number, then I think, oh, maybe there's some disagreement, and then we'll actually talk more specifically about that card. So this serves as like a decent way to start a conversation, but it is not a substitute for that conversation. It's an invitation to start thinking critically about a certain topic. Another thing that I think is pretty useful is the bite-size articles. I mean, I did link them. There's like a whole video about them, and I think it's useful. Why? I think the cards on that list are strong enough, whatever that means, that it's worth reading about why they are that strong, even though it's not entirely clear what it means. And that doesn't mean that cards that didn't get bite-sized articles will never be good. And it just means that I thought those cards were worth writing about, and I use stats as one of the many tools to help me decide on that list. And the list is definitely arbitrary. I'm not going to pretend that it isn't. And that's it. Like, in terms of actual strategic value that you can get from stats, there's really not anything more I think they have to offer. I've made content related to these things that I think are good, and I think that's the full extent of how useful stats can be, and anything else I just don't think is worth getting into. There is other non-strategic value. You can analyze and discuss all this stuff to great detail. Some people really love doing that, and if you do, great. Just realize that these types of discussions are starting from a place that is fundamentally divorced from real games of Dominion. So in my mind, it's just arguing for the sake of arguing. If you like doing that, great. But if you actually think you're going to improve your play by that, I'm going to start to disagree with that. So let's talk about another thing. Let's talk about simulation. There are a couple of Dominion simulators out there. What are simulators? Well, you have these things that are called bots. Bots are just a list of choices on what cards to buy in certain situations. So if I had 8 money, I'd buy this card. Or if I have 6 money and I don't already have a copy of whatever, then I'll buy a whatever that costs 6 or something. Simulators will then take those bots and play a large number of simulated games of Dominion, and then they'll come back and say, hey, this bot won this percentage of the game. So that's what simulators do. The buy rules for bots that I talked about can check for a lot of different types of conditions and can be very sophisticated. However, the rules for how the bots will play out the turns using the cards that they have tend to be very simplistic, and sometimes adjustments can be made, but usually that's not by the end user, and that part isn't nearly as advanced. You may see simulation results used out there to tell you all kinds of things, and it's true that there's a number of things that simulation results are good for. Unfortunately, the point I'm going to make here is I don't think there's much overlap between what you see and what simulation is good for. So let's start by looking at some benchmark strategies that sim results have come up with. So I think the 2 most popular ones that people reference are double jack and triple gear, where you play money density and you get 2 jacks, or you play money density and you get 3 gears. Okay, and these strategies were heavily optimized for kingdoms that include only that card. And they also have pretty decent numbers. I mean, these bots are pretty good at doing what they do, and they beat a lot of other bots. That's pretty cool. The issue is that nobody ever plays games of Dominion with only one kingdom card. So once there's any change at all in that kingdom, you start to see immediately fundamental differences in what you want to do compared to what these bots do. And specific examples, normally you don't actually get a second Jack of all trades unless you're being heavily junked. In this case, you probably get the junker 2 and then maybe even more than 2 jacks. Otherwise, you're getting like 1 jack and maybe some other stuff. Or like for gear, opening gear and getting the 3rd gear as soon as possible is great if the only price points you ever care about hitting are 3 and 6. And otherwise, you're just never opening with 2 gears, and you're almost never getting that 3rd gear because you would rather get silver or something. You care about other price points and other cards. But people read these simulation results and they don't know that it doesn't have this context. And they'll play the bot openings for way too long before looking for other support. And this is just really bad. You can almost always do better in real games of Dominion than these bot strategies. Another issue with simulation, it begins, that it doesn't really handle interaction with the opponent very well unless specific interactions are specifically programmed into the bot. There is interaction in every game of Dominion. But a lot of games that stay within the money density paradigm have simple enough interactions that they can be programmed into bots with a reasonable amount of success. So some things that they don't handle by default very well are like anything related to piles running out, and that's the exception is victory piles. You know, a lot of the endgame dancing around victory piles, especially the provinces, can be programmed and usually is programmed into the bots. But these kind of things usually just lose to opponents who can find a 3-pile ending, right? 3 piles just are almost never considered because the bots don't even know what other cards are there, right? If the opponent's doing anything at all other than money density, plus maybe like 1 kingdom card, so like a better payload than a province per turn, or like any sort of endgame dancing beyond the penultimate province rule, which, if you remember, is something I told you to forget absolutely everything you know about, because it doesn't come close to what you actually want to do in terms of Dominion, right? But that's really all that the bots can do. Or like finding win conditions based on what the opponent is doing. So if the opponent is going for something other than provinces to score VP, you need to get all 8 provinces to win. So don't buy duchies, right? Or, you know, noticing low piles and trying to 3-pile while you're ahead. Another thing the bots are not good at is finding support for its basic strategy from other available kingdom cards. And this may seem like a minor thing, but it actually ends up having a pretty detrimental effect on how people interpret simulation results in the past. You can optimize for exactly 1 card and get some very, very different results than what is actually good in real games of Dominion. So simulators are good at playing really simple strategies against other really simple strategies, and you can also get some pretty decent benchmarks for simple strategies that you may be able to compare to more complex strategies. So for example, a certain strategy gets 5 provinces by turn Y, 8 provinces by turn Z. You can also study how those strategies are affected by having certain types of attacks played consistently on them. You could even study different builds where combining 2 or more different cards together, you see what works well and what effects different types of support have on your main strategy. Unfortunately, you almost never see this actually happening because it is a lot of work. You usually have to do more work if you want more value, rip in peace. And that's really where the useful part of simulation ends. You can almost always do better in a real game of Dominion than what a bot will do, and once you deviate from exactly what these bots are doing, the results start to become meaningless very quickly. There's another fundamental problem, which is that as optimized as bots claim to be, you really have no way of knowing if the bots can be improved upon, especially if the people making the claims aren't willing to share the bots they use, which for some reason they usually aren't. I don't understand that. If you really want to figure out which of 2 strategies is best on a given kingdom, what that would look like is you would refine each bot that's playing against each other iteratively a lot to account for improvements in the other bots' play, noticing what they're doing, taking your own draws into account, that kind of thing. Needless to say, this takes forever, and I've never seen anyone do it. Plus, you can never actually know when you can stop doing that, but to get results that are even close to accurate, that's what it would look like. So we know what simulation is good for and what it's not good for. And as I said before, the big issue is a lot of what you see out there about simulation is not the stuff that simulation is good at. You're going to see results like money plus X beats money plus Y by whatever percent. And it looks like that says you should just play money X whenever X and Y are available. And obviously, that's pretty awful advice. Frequently, you're going to incorporate both X and Y into your money strategy. But sometimes you might adjust money X to account for Y being there, or maybe you just won't play money at all and you just throw all of it out. So yeah, with simulation 2, you got to look at what the claims are, realize what the data can show, and then you can be properly skeptical of what you see while getting the value you can out of what's there. So to bring it all home, just be skeptical. Be skeptical of what data appears to tell you. And realize, stats, simulation, any kind of these metrics that get you further away from real games of Dominion, that's exactly what they're doing. They apply less to what you're actually doing to win games of Dominion. And, in general, just be skeptical of everything. No matter how certain people are when they state something to you, realize that general advice doesn't always apply. In fact, it almost never does. And there's an exception to pretty much everything in Dominion. Once you start thinking for yourself, things are going to start making more sense to you, and that's how you start getting better than good people, as you start realizing what you can do that they're coming short on. So I hope that this video is going to invite you to start thinking for yourself. The tutorial series is here to give you the fundamentals, and as of the end of this video, I don't have any more fundamentals to tell you. Everything that I realize later on can be a fundamental I'll put in the middle of the series, but at this point, if you've gotten here and you're comfortable with everything I've told you, then definitely start thinking for yourself. Definitely be skeptical of everything that people tell you. Be careful of results that come without context, and make sure you understand what data is showing you in-game or out of game before you start making conclusions and just assuming those kind of things are true. As always, thanks for watching the series. Leave a comment if you have any questions, and yeah, have fun playing Dominion.